Managing Violence Podcast, Season 4, Episode 9 with Denise Koster. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Managing Violence Podcast. We've got a very important topic to discuss today with Denise Koster from Koster Consulting. Now, you may not have heard of Denise. She is not a typical guest, but a very important guest. She's worked in the area of violence since 1985, and she's also a graduate of Gavin Debeckers Threat Assessment and Management Academy. She's a certified threat manager, and she specializes in workplace violence as well as elder abuse. She's got a very interesting career that started off in social work, working with elderly victims of abuse and domestic violence, and has moved into the occupational setting. And we talk at length about her origins, working with the elderly and vulnerable populations, as well as talking about what she does now in a workplace and how to fix violent and abusive workplace cultures, and also some of the risks that are on the horizon with the current lockdown situation. So it's a very important and detailed conversation. I thank Denise very much for making herself available for it. She does have a book that's out at the moment, which we'll plug throughout the episode, so make sure you check that out. It certainly is well worth a read. All right, just before we get into that, I just want to plug some businesses. As I said last week, I'm looking to reach out to listeners or people that have services that may benefit our listeners that are doing it tough at the moment thanks to the lockdown or the coronavirus layoffs, and they've still got services that are available. So I was offering up 3 free sponsor slots. So I want to name a couple of businesses and give you some links to check out what they do. Now, the first one I want to mention is Valhalla Strength Shop. So Valhalla Strength Shop is owned by a friend of mine, Scott Wasson. Scott was actually my first powerlifting coach. Really awesome guy, very charitable, generous guy, has given away so much to the powerlifting and strength training community. He's always been very forthcoming with his knowledge and his insight, and has helped me out in a lot of ways, both when I was running a gym previously and also just as a coach. He manufactures some of the highest quality strength training equipment anywhere in Australia. And I highly recommend, if you are looking for a home setup, all gyms are closed at the moment here in Australia. So there's a lot of people that are looking for home gear and they're buying cheap imported gear. If you've got a little bit of extra money to spend, send it to an Aussie company that employs family and friends, and also uses other businesses for their upholstery and for their sandblasting and for all the different bits and pieces. It's all done locally in Brisbane, and if you buy from Valhalla, you're supporting multiple Australian families, not buying cheap mass-manufactured equipment. I highly recommend it. His deadlift platforms, his belt squat machines, his monolifts, his bench presses, everything is commercial standard, made with Aussie steel, really, really high quality. You will pay a bit more than what you'll pay for cheap stuff, but the quality means this thing will last for lifetimes, plural, multiple lifetimes. You can pass it down to your great-grandchildren and let them get yoked as well. Anyway, that's Scott Wasson at Valhalla Strength Shop. His website is valhallastrengthshop.com.au, VALHALLA strengthshop.com.au. Check them out if you want to get strong while on lockdown. #apocalypse strong. All right, the next business I'd like to plug is a former guest of the show, Mr. Russ Jarmisty. Russ is offering up his excellent DVD set as a direct download. His DVD set is called Brutal Bouncer. If you're after pure and applied self-defense and combatives that has been tried and tested in the harshest of nightclub doors in the world, you can't go past Russ's material. The Brutal Bouncer DVD set. Russ was kind enough to send me a copy to review, which I will be doing in due course. But I highly recommend checking that out. He's got a special on that. If you want to take advantage of that, head over to jarmistymartialarts.com. It's JARMESTY martialarts.com. Check out the shop. Hit Russ up. Let him know you want to buy a copy, and I'm sure he'll be happy to help you out. Russell Jarmisty Brutal Bouncer DVD set at jarmistymartialarts.com. And the very last for this particular episode is another former guest of the show, another POM, sorry guys, another English gent, Mr. Matt State. Matt was a guest early on in the podcast, and he's been very active in the social media world since the lockdown and since his dojos had to temporarily close. And he's offering his own online products as well for you to check out. You can find those over at modernsamurai.online, www.modernsamurai.online. Matt has a ton of knowledge, not only about martial arts, but also about marketing on social media. So if you're interested in that as well, hit him up on LinkedIn or on Facebook or on TikTok. He is a TikTok maverick, but hit him up and I'm sure he'll be happy to help you out. That's it. Those are our 3 bonus sponsors for this particular episode. Thank you for listening to the plugs. I think it's very important that we support our community and we support those that help us. So if you could please indulge me by listening to the ads, clicking on or following the links in the show notes to support those if they have a product that could help you, just to help keep these great human beings afloat during very difficult times. All right, that's enough rambling. It is time to get into the podcast with Denise Koster. Hi, Denise. Thanks for joining us on the Managing Violence podcast. It's great to have you on.
Great to be on, Joe.
Yeah, we've started trying to organise this a little while ago, and then we had a couple of hiccups. You got ill and had pneumonia, and I moved house and moved studio, and we had scheduling conflicts. And I've often said to other guests, we've had these hiccups that, sometimes the more resistance you have to overcome, the better quality the episode will be eventually. So fingers crossed that this one should knock it out of the park, I think.
Absolutely.
So Denise, you have a different kind of background to most of the guests we've had on the show before, in that you specialize in elder abuse and also workplace violence, in particular bullying and harassment. So I'd really like to unpack your story. You've just released a book, which I'll let you talk about. But in that book, that you start off with your introduction to this field, and I think it's such a powerful topic. It's such a powerful story, rather, that I'd really like to hear it from you.
Absolutely. Well, it's sort of 30 years of experience that I've had working in the area of violence. It wasn't a field that I expected to become involved in. When I was in university, I was in my 3rd year. I had a placement in a senior center in a inner city, low-income downtown area where there was very high needs. And one of my first jobs was going into the homes of elderly clients and assessing them for health and social services. And back in the 80s, there was no talk of, abuse of elderly, either in the community or in long-term care. But when I went into the homes of these elderly clients, they were disclosing all sorts of situations of violence, either be it by family members, paid caregivers, neighbors, to discover stories, such as a woman that was paying her son $500 a month to see her grandchildren. A woman who was in her 80s that was denied her pain medication in order to pay her son. Really, when she received her check, he would withhold her medication for a few days prior to release of her pension check. And when she signed over the pension check to him, she was then given her medication to a 89-year-old woman that was raped by her son-in-law. Wow. And these situations were disclosed to me, not out of me asking, but through just basically doing a needs assessment. I then started documenting all these cases, and I went to my employer at the time, and I said, these individuals, these older adults, are being neglected. They need something more than a shopping service or a volunteer to visit them. They need interventions regarding the situations that they're in, particularly because it was an extremely vulnerable population, low income, high need, low education, some addiction problems. So I really was able to influence my employer and create myself a job, which was the elder abuse worker, which was basically, I carried a caseload of about 50 or 60 abused elderly in the community, helping them negotiate through either social or legal systems. I did that for 5 years, and I met a woman probably after I started this work. Her name was Norma, and she was referred to me in order to get a shopping service. I went to her apartment. The red flags were going up in regards to the environment, her demeanor. Told her about all the basic shopping services and personal care services. I then told her about the abuse services that I provided, which is really just supporting people that were in a violent situation. I shortly learned she was living with her husband. She had no telephone, no really means of getting a hold of me. And then probably a few weeks later, after I had did my initial assessment with her, she then passed a note to the volunteer shopper to give to me when they returned back to the office to do paperwork, that said 2 words, and those 2 words were "help me." Ran through the community. She had either been sexually assaulted or beaten. Within 24 hours of me being there, it got to the point where I was visiting her on a daily basis. I worked with her for 4 years. She was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Her husband was arrested for breaking her arm. A month later, he was arrested again for breaking her other arm. During the course of the 4 years I worked with her, I was trying to get her to, potentially move her situation, or I was trying to get some type of intervention to protect her, although she was determined this was her walk of life. And I ended up, the last time she was in the hospital, she made a final decision to call the police and move into a long-term care facility. Her husband was arrested for assault. He was released a few hours later. I had gone to the husband's home in the meantime. I had come back to the office to arrange services so she would be safe when she returned home. And ultimately, I received a call the day after she was released from the hospital that her husband had beaten her to death when she returned home from the hospital.
Yeah.
So as a result of that, I got completely involved in the whole world of violence, and that then sort of 25 years later, I'm speaking to you.
Yeah, wow. It's when I read the start of your book with that story, it's hard not to have your blood boil to think of, especially an elderly person being abused in that way, and the fact that even a terminal cancer diagnosis didn't change the abuse. That in itself is just it's really hard to fathom that someone could have that in their life. And there was one comment that she made to you that really hit a chord with me, where she was talking about her childhood and then her young womanhood, and how she just had accepted that this is her role. I think she said, I was raped and beaten as a child, I was raped and beaten as a young woman, and now I'm raped and beaten as an old lady. This is just who I am, or something to that effect. And that,
yes.
Oh man, that's just destroying to think that the conditioning of growing up in a certain way and having that prolonged exposure just ruined her will to live, or her will for something better.
It really did. And I think, sort of the whole time I was there, I had to be so incredibly careful that I didn't do anything that disallowed me to come and see her, because I was, other than the shopper that would drop the groceries at the door. I was the only really human contact that she had because she didn't even have a telephone. And I was just so weary about, I had to be so careful not to be told I could not return. And when she ultimately made the decision to say enough is enough, then she lost her life. And I think that for myself, even talking about it now, Norma drives me to do what I do. Norma is in some ways my guardian angel in the way that I thought her and I would have no more met each other than anyone. It was a situation where I knocked on the door, and Norma has changed my life, and I think in some ways I changed hers. The end of that story, I still to this day look back and think, could I have done things differently? Could I have saved Norma? And I think that ultimately we have to learn that adults, regardless of their age, have to make decisions, and Norma made those decisions in her life based on her conditioning.
Yeah, and we'll get into your transition into workplace violence, but just while we're on the topic of elder abuse, we talked a little bit offline about the current pandemic and the isolation and so on, and the risks that may bring. Do you think there's anything we can do or anything we need to be aware of in terms of elder abuse, where we may now have elderly and vulnerable people that have less social contact than before, they don't have as many visitors before, they're really going to be more isolated and behind closed doors than ever before in the next, however long it is, whether it's a couple of months, whether it's 6 months, whether it's a year. Do you think that is a red flag in terms of our protection of those that are potentially being abused?
Well, I think there's sort of the two streams when you're speaking of abuse of older adults. I think one stream is the older adults that live in the community. So they're living in, private homes or even public housing, but they're living independently. I think the risk that we're already seeing now or reading online, and that's not just speaking of what's happening to older adults, but everyone, where people are actually jumping on, the fraud bandwagon and selling products to people or making promises, making phone calls and saying, you have the virus, you have to get a kit, it's going to cost you $2,000. I think all ages are vulnerable to that, but I think older adults, just, someone offering to do their shopping or somebody offering to provide them a service during this pandemic, when they don't, a lot of abused elderly, unfortunately, that are already abused prior to what's happening right now, have very, very small social networks, and they are very isolated to begin with, and that's why the abuse is allowed to continue until there is some sort of an intervention. And I think that those individuals living in neighborhoods, they are vulnerable. They still do, at least in Ontario and Canada, and I know around the world, they receive a pension check. Their vulnerability, I think, is absolutely heightened through this whole process. And then I think the second stream is the older adults that are living in long-term care facilities. We're seeing in British Columbia, there's been, at least to my last knowledge, there was 6 deaths with the virus. But in addition to that, I think that, if staff does get sick, I know in Ontario, there's already staff shortage of clinical people. The amount of care that they have to provide to extremely vulnerable individuals, I think that abuse within the homes potentially will increase because staff losing their tolerance because of all the pressures around them. Nurses are getting isolated, where family members don't want to see nurses because they're afraid that they're going to catch something from them.
Sure.
So I think with the increase of just the whole long-term care not being fully prepared to manage older adults, by default, when we add this on top of it, is absolutely going to increase the risk to vulnerable adults.
Yeah. It's such a unprecedented time in terms of all these secondary and tertiary risks that are going to come up as a result of our treatment of the primary risk being the virus. It's sadly we can sort of acknowledge that there are more risks, but what to do about it is the challenge. Moving back to your story, so you started working in elder abuse, and now, if I understand correctly, your consulting is predominantly around workplace violence, bullying, and harassment. So, how did that take place?
Well, initially, when I was a clinical director at a community health center after I had left sort of the frontline work where I had met Norma. I was in that position for 5 years, but as a result of the death of Norma, I was very involved I started a elder abuse network. I was, sort of advocating to try to get this issue dealt with. I then left my clinical director job and I focused on elder abuse within my Koster Consulting, that I was getting called in to deal with issues of, abuse either in a hospital, long-term care facility, working with the developmentally delayed individuals. And then at that point, couple of maybe even months into really doing this work intently and the training, I had a group of frontline staff come up to me and say, this is really important. And of course we need to treat our, patients or our clients, residents with dignity and respect. But what about us? What about all the things that we have to deal with on the front line, from being yelled at, screamed at, inappropriately touched? I mean, racism is alive and well and living in our country. And what staff have to contend to on a day-to-day basis, not only by aggressive, patients, clients, it's family members, it's outside service providers. And I sort of thought, right, I can't walk in here, point fingers at people and say, you need to treat people well, when they're being, in some cases, punching bags to others. Although abuse is never acceptable, they're the professional, they're going to get triggered, they need to take a deep breath and walk out of the room. But I also thought they need to have the tools to be able to deal with violent, aggressive behaviors that are coming towards them by others. So I started managing out my sessions and not just focusing on, abuse of the public, but also how to deal with the difficult and aggressive behaviors that are coming towards the staff. While I was in these work environments talking about either of those topics, I then started to have both labor and management approach me and say, Denise, this probably has nothing to do with why you're here, but we seem to have problems amongst the staff members. We seem to have what they were calling interpersonal conflicts. So frontline workers were fighting with frontline was fighting with managers were fighting with everybody. And this was not just, happening within sort of health and social services, but within all other industries. And I was getting called in as a mediator to try to get everyone to, to sit down and play nice and be good to each other. But when I was going into these environments, I wasn't seeing interpersonal conflicts at all. What I was actually seeing was bullying in the workplace. I wasn't seeing someone say, Joe, I don't like what you just said or did right now, but, I'm okay with that. We disagree. I'm cool with that. I can still work with you today. That's not what I was seeing. What I was actually seeing was that one individual targeting another one, campaigning against them to get everyone else to turn against them, to ultimately push them out of the organization. One of three ways: I'm going to make your life miserable so you quit. I'm going to torment you to the point where you have a physical or mental breakdown and you've got to go. Or I'm going to set you up for errors so you get fired. So again, what I was seeing was bullying, harassment, discrimination in the workplace. So it's sort of been this real evolution where it started out, very specific to the world of elder abuse. And then it started getting into the whole discrimination, harassment, by external and internal parties. And then, harassment is generally one step towards, I mean, violence is a pathway towards aggression, towards a directed behavior to harm an individual either psychologically or physically. I was starting to see more of workplace violence come out of these harassment cases. And then that's when I started looking into the whole issue of, you know, becoming involved in threat assessments and preventative violent measures in order to deal with all of those issues that were pertaining to the workplace.
Yeah, wow. So it's such a logical evolution when you lay it out like that. And I think sometimes one of the mistakes we make is we silo these different areas and say, well, that's a HR issue because that's a bullying and harassment issue, but workplace violence is a security issue, or it's a health and safety issue as opposed to a HR issue. And but really they cross over, and they one leads to the other or feeds into the other. And as you say, I mean, they have to be connected. They are connected.
Well, absolutely. And I think what happened for me, as this evolution was happening, that I certainly did plan on, it just sort of fell, and the lights were coming on, and I was reading and researching and trying to figure out this whole phenomena. But even if you look at the whole issue of elder abuse or resident abuse in a long-term care facility, what I discovered was that organizations are mandated to do abuse prevention. The staff have to go through thou shalt not leave a resident on the toilet, talk disrespectfully, over medicate them. But what I realized was organizations that deal with vulnerable populations need to get their house in order. So if they're have infighting and they're not having a positive, non-toxic work environment, abuse is going to happen, because what I found was the bullies in the workplace and the abusers in the workplace are also the bullies in the workplace. So most investigations, when I'm doing a resident abuse investigation, then an outcome is another investigation which is pertaining to workplace bullying, because the individuals that have witnessed this person be inappropriate, steal corporate time, abuse the elderly, are too afraid to report them. So what I realized was that the whole workplace bullying and harassment, if you get that under control, the rest will take care of itself. Dealing with aggressive residents or public members, if people are healthy, I'd say to you, Joe, you know what, that person is aggressive, I'll take your place, you do my job, or I'll come in and pitch in. Where if people are even dealing in customer services, where they have an irate customer coming in, yelling and screaming or threatening an employee, if there's a bullying or a toxic work environment, people will have that person just standing there taking the abuse. So you have to get your house in order to deal with outside aggressions, violence, all of those domestic violence that may come in. That's what I learned, is the link is, it all comes down to a healthy, non-toxic work environment, working short. If there's a no bully there, people can work like a machine. They figure out exactly what to do. You could have 6 extra staff on a shift, and if there's a bully there, there's chaos.
Yeah,
So
and
it's the relationship between the individuals that either make or break how their work evolves throughout the day.
absolutely, and the impact on productivity and morale, even staff turnover, the cohesion of the team. So much is impacted by internal conflict, and if that's not addressed, then it does have measurable impact. It's not just something to be. It's not just nice to have a good culture. It's essential.
It is essential, and most workplaces have a code of conduct, that may be there and hung on a wall for everyone to see. But code of conducts are breached every day in the workplace, and people are not made accountable for those codes. I always say that if people if employees or employers, managers spoke or acted towards the public the way they do to each other, they would be terminated.
Yeah,
You,
very true.
you can't make fun of a customer, what they're wearing. You can't, call them a derogatory term. You can't ice them out. All the things that happen in the workplace would not be accepted if it was done to a member of the public. So I challenge organizations when they say we have a violent-free workplace. I said, yes, if you do, that includes everyone, not just the customer.
Yeah. Do you find that in certain industries it's more endemic than others? I mean, I found personally that some industries it's just kind of accepted that, oh yeah, well, if you want to work in this industry, you're going to have to, accept that there's a lot of egos and there's a lot of abuse and bullying and suck it up and move on. Do you find that differs from industry to industry that you're consulting in?
I find that the mentality is there because I deal with everything from, again, and my roots were social services and healthcare, and now it's from construction to retail to all industries. And every time I come in either to do education or to do an investigation, I have either be an HR manager come and pull me aside and say, we're different, we're unique. Here's the things you need to know in order to do your job. And everybody thinks they're unique. They think, oh, because they're working on a roof in the freezing cold, it's different than a nurse that's working in an emergency, or a teacher that's dealing with teenagers and hormones. Everyone, I think, has their story as to why the behavior is happening. There's always that, you need to realize, Denise, that we are blank. Or, it's a group of men. That's how men speak, not the men that I associate with. I think there's a lot of stereotypes. Oh, women gossip. Men gossip too. I think that, if it's an emergency services, they say, well, it's black humor. And even that term, black humor, is inappropriate. It's dark humor because, we deal with this type of. So I think it's the same across the board. An investigation is an investigation. Violence is violence. The pathway is the same. But I think the players tend to minimize behaviors within their own industry because they've been conditioned to accept the unacceptable. That's the name of my title of my book, because in certain industries it's acceptable. That someone behaves a certain way, or someone has a different demeanor than others, or some behaviors are accepted while others are they raise the bar. To me, if you raise the bar of professionalism, everyone has to meet the bar regardless of their position or their profession. And that's where I see people making those excuses in the work that I do.
Yeah, and I think that's a really valid point. I mean, everyone thinks that they've got a reason for why they do what they do, or why they've accepted the norm in their environment. And I think just from my experience working in a couple of different areas, it almost becomes sort of a running gag. I mean, when I worked in the health service, the number of complaints internally that we had against surgeons. Surgeons were sort of recognized as being the egomaniacs of the healthcare service, and that they were always antisocial and they were abusive and aggressive. And I'm obviously not all surgeons. I know we have a couple of surgeons that actually listen to the podcast. So I'm not talking about you guys. I'm talking about everybody else. But that was kind of accepted, that nursing that worked in a surgical environment or in theatre accepted a level of verbal abuse or shortness because of the environment, which they maybe wouldn't have accepted if they were working on the ward, which I found kind of fascinating. And in hospitality, it was always the chefs. I mean, the Gordon Ramsay is like the archetype, but there was a certain level of abuse that was expected to come from a chef, which is kind of surreal when you think about it. But yeah, it is interesting how we just got to like, oh, well, that's just him, or that's just that role. He has to be like that because he's a chef. It's very weird.
Or the untouchable, and that's one of the things that I had spoke in the workplace violence chapter of the book, where I talk about, you know, the murder suicide of Lori DuPont, a nurse that was murdered in Windsor, Ontario, by a physician. And one of the big things that came out of that was the public inquiry that talked about the fact that in these physicians were perceived as the untouchable. And, you know, as I will always state, since that situation, that tragedy happened, was that I believe that a murder of a nurse at 5 to 9 in a hospital actually ripped off the face of violence, ripped off the mask of violence and said, this is it. Because I think we still stereotype as to, you know, certain professions are either can behave, as we just spoke of, or certain behaviors aren't capable of being violent, or they are considered the untouchable. And I think that when we looked at, you know, privilege killing privilege in this case, it really got, at least, you know, the province that I live in, Ontario, it really said, oh my goodness, it's not the person that's hiding in a corner or jumping out from a stairwell at someone at work. It's actually everyone has the potential to be violent, and behaviors have to be, people have to be made accountable. The code of conduct should apply to everybody, not just certain positions or professions.
Yeah, and the code of conduct is, look, I know on a practical level, sometimes the code of conduct can be ignored if someone is hard to replace, or they're important to the general operation, so they're given a lot more slack because, you know, well, if we get rid of him, it's going to impact the bottom line tremendously. So it's actually easier to get rid of the victim as opposed to get rid of the perpetrator. Have you found that to be the case in your investigations?
Absolutely. People will say, well, they're a little rough around the edges, but they do a really good job. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, I think that hiring positions, people need to hire for not only skill, but attitude. And I think that emotional intelligence, interviewing, and all those tools that we can use to get the right person in place is really important, because I think that the whole concept of, you know, it's easier to keep the person than replace them is a myth. I think that it's easier to take a position. I mean, maybe if they have a very unique position and need skill-based in education, it's harder to delegate those tasks. But yes, the target oftentimes is the person that leaves. They're on a disability because of stress, and they don't come back. And years later, the bully or the harasser is still in the workplace, and the number of casualties left in behind are tremendous in some organizations. And some people believe they are untouchable because they're the CEO or they're a mayor, a council member. A number of cases I've been involved in with high profile, oh, we can't touch them. Well, unfortunately, that is the reality of the thought process. But I think that if organizations were to all band together and say enough is enough, and everyone have the courage to come forward, and that's what doesn't happen. People fear the retaliation, and we see that now with the whole Me Too movement and all the things that are happening on in the news. Is it's easier to get rid of the target than deal with the person at the top that's creating the havoc.
Yeah, and I think just as some people can be conditioned to be victims through prolonged abuse throughout their lives, I think sometimes the aggressor or the abuser can be conditioned that this behavior is acceptable, and we see that, you know, with Me Too, and we also see it in other areas as well, where someone's got away with something for 20 years, and therefore they assume that that's okay, and that if people have an issue with it now, it's because people are getting soft, not because the behavior was always wrong, and just no one called you out on it before. It's kind of surreal that we get this this distorted perception that just because you got away with something for so long, or people turned a blind eye to it before, that behavior is actually correct and acceptable.
And I do see that in investigations where someone might be there for years and they are known to harass or discriminate against each others. And what ends up happening is when it comes down to the first time that they're actually called up on it, and there's a formal investigation based on legislation, I have cases where the respondent gets called in and says, you've been named, we're putting you on notice, you've been named as a person, that's, harassing others. We're putting you on a paid leave of absence pending an investigation. That person then goes directly to their physician, says to their physician, I just went to work. Now they're accusing me of bullying or harassment. They then provide a sick note to their employer. They're the respondent. And when they're on a medical leave, you can't touch them. You can't investigate. You can't have them come in. So I've had cases. I had one case where the respondent was off for 2.5 years on a stress leave because the employer had called them out on their behavior. And by the time I was able to get to that person 2.5 years later, when they finally came back to work, there were 7 complainants against that manager. All of them were gone.
Yeah, wow.
So I still had to deal with that person, but their response to being called out was to get a medical note.
Play the victim.
Saying that the employer caused them to have a breakdown based on accusing them of being a bully or a harasser or whatever the topic of concern was at that time.
What sort of practical advice would you give to an organization? Let's say we've got an executive team or a board that is aware that they have issues with bullying and harassment within their workforce, and they're looking to take some sort of steps to eradicate it or to fix it. What sort of advice would you give to get started?
Well, I think that in each jurisdiction, there's legislation now. For example, as I mentioned, the murder of Laurie DuPont, the nurse in Windsor, Ontario, as a result of that occurred in 2005. In 2010, for example, we have legislation that mandates that once employers become aware of workplace, violence, discrimination, bullying, that they're legislated, by the Ministry of Labor to investigate that. So I think that legislation can make a difference, because I think before people or leaders were able to say, you know what, we don't want to deal with that. We don't want to open that can of worms. Now they're accountable. And I always tell people leaders to remember 3 words. It's once they have knowledge, they have accountability. And once they have accountability, they have liability. So I think that for the mere fact that, as you stated or posed the question, if they have knowledge or they think that someone's doing that, they really have to just take that person to task. I think what ends up happening, they need to do a formal investigation. If it's a leader in that position, which is where people are more reluctant to deal with the issue, they must go externally, because there's a bias if HR is doing an investigation on their CEO. I think that the first step is acknowledging that it's there, and then it's actually dealing with it. But I think in order to deal with that, they have to create an environment where frontline staff or non-leaders or labor aren't afraid to come forward for fear of retaliation of losing their job. Whistleblower protection, they have to set a foundation of unacceptable of behavior not being acceptable regardless of position, and the whole whistleblower protection. And they actually not only put it in a policy, but they actually implement systems so that people feel safe. Because if people aren't coming forward, then those people, the individuals that have that ill behavior, are not going to be made accountable. Because witnesses, complainants are going to quit before they have to face the wrath of coming forward and an issue not being dealt with or swept under the carpet.
Yeah, one of the things that I hear that troubles me, because I'm not sure it's a black and white answer, is, well, we just want them to sort it out amongst themselves. You know, it's you two grown-ups. Surely you can sort this out for yourself. Do you think there's a spectrum there of when it is something that's reasonable for you to address yourself and to be able to try and, you know, resolve whatever the conflict is, but also there's a time when you need to involve whether it's your HR team or you need to make a complaint and make things official. How do you navigate that sort of response?
Well, I think that if individuals, by nature, if individuals have an issue with someone that they feel safe and comfortable with, to the degree of being able to say, you know, I feel disrespected that every time I'm speaking to a customer, you interrupt and take over the conversation. I would appreciate if you didn't do it anymore, for example. I think that if people could work them out, it would never come onto the radar of managers. I know that the people that I've dealt with over the past 25 years and all the targets and people I've spoke to, most people deal with the issue at least for 18 months before they come forward. And I think that it's, and this might not be the proper word, but it's a little disrespectful if a staff member comes in to a manager's office or goes to the union and says, you know, I'm having an issue with an individual, and that person says to them, have you spoke to them?
Yeah.
They've exhausted everything. And the fact that they finally came forward and it's even on leaders' radar, I think that they have tried to deal with it themselves. I think they've tried to sort it out. When I do investigations, the first question I ask people of the complainant is, describe the history of your relationship with that individual and how it's changed from the time you started until the day you put in the complaint. There's always a catalyst event. It's not just the person didn't like me from the day I started. There's a catalyst, there's a disagreement, there's a conflict. When that conflict comes forward, and generally it is known by leadership that someone has an argument in the lunchroom, or someone is, you know, points a finger at someone and is disrespectful in a meeting, instead of management coming in and saying, okay, the two of you need to sit right now, we're going to do a mediated session, we're going to get it all out on the table and deal with it. That's not what happens. That the comment such as, you need to sort it out, I'm not a babysitter, these are grown adults. I believe that people will sort their issues out if they are capable of that. But when they're not capable of that, for whatever reason that may be, one fears the other, or one has threatened the other, or they're uncomfortable, that's when leadership needs to jump in. The moment that they know that there's an issue, they can jump in and mediate a situation. Gavin Debeckers, who wrote The Gift of Fear, and again, to paraphrase what he says is, and I say it to my clients all the time, listen to the voice when it's still a whisper. Once you start hearing or seeing people that aren't sitting together at the lunch table anymore, or someone that used to be social is now sitting outside in their car on their breaks, that meetings are silent when certain individuals are in attendance, yet people are participating when they're not there, they need to say, what is going on? Why is this week's meeting different than last week's meeting? They need to do health and safety audits of the mental health and the behavioral changes within the work environment. But managers need to be on the floor and talk to workers, not just at the time that someone comes forward, makes the complaint, and then the response is, you need to sort this out yourself. Because
Yeah, I think there's,
job as a manager is to deal with issues, interpersonal, whatever it may be.
Yeah, I think the emotional intelligence of managers is something that it's become a bit of a buzzword, but I think it is so important to actually be able to read the tension in a room or the emotion of people, or to pay attention to the psyche of the people they're looking after, because essentially that's what they're doing. They're there to look after and make sure everyone's performing. And I think it's so overlooked as an attribute. And sometimes people get promoted to a management position based on their ability to do the role that they're managing, not necessarily their ability to actually manage people. And
Absolutely, yes.
yeah, it's in fact, I actually, I'm not sure a friend is too strong a word, but someone I knew was managing a team of commission sales persons. I won't say what industry because it might give away who it is, but commission-based salespeople. And he actually liked stirring up conflict between the salespeople because he thought it made them more competitive. he liked it if his salespeople didn't like each other. So he actually would instigate conflicts, petty conflicts, to try and make them more more aggressive with each other. And he felt that if anyone didn't handle it, they weren't cut out for sales. I mean, talk about toxic culture.
Right, and that's why when a number of organizations now are not commission based, it actually creates a healthier work environment, because there's not that stepping over each other in order to make the sale. It's, you're giving a salary. You might get a bonus at the end of the year for doing more sales, so you're still rewarded, but it's not creating that culture of not a team, but an individual competition that ends up happening.
Yeah, one thing I've seen work is actually a team bonus as well. So when the team hits a target, there's a separate commission. So even if you're getting commission on your sales, you still benefit from other people being successful as well, which I think can go some way to mitigate that me against the world mentality.
Absolutely, and I was at a doing some work at a hospital, and the CEO had to come in. It was an intervention on a just a toxic department of the hospital, and the CEO of the hospital came in because it was that serious, and I was kind of doing an education and an intervention and such. But the CEO said, I thought this was just an amazing thing. He said, the definition of a team is truly simple. It's making the other guy look good. And I thought, that's fantastic. It's not this, we need A, B, and C. It's saying, making that other person look good without other people having to know. So someone does make errors. We're all human. We make a mistake. So you clean up the mistake without letting the world know that I made a mistake. And I just thought that was such a simple way of just saying that's truly a team. Not making the other person look bad or not showcasing my skill and I have more knowledge and experience than you. It was just working together for a common goal and a common good. If we just took it to those basics rather than that competitive, we need competition, but there's a line between what's healthy and what is abusive.
Yeah, and again, we keep coming back to culture, and I think it's such a again. I feel like in the last 10 years, workplace culture or the culture of the team has been beaten to death by pop science to the point where people now switch off whenever they hear culture. But it is so important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think now that the fact that and it, not just with our current health situation across the world, but it's just the whole issue of just being kind. And I think now people are doing, hashtag kindness, and I've done it on my LinkedIn, but I think, why are we even having to say be kind? Because things have shifted. Things have shifted to, people not being kind to each other. And maybe this whole, pandemic that's happening right now, yes, we talked earlier about the fact that people may take advantage of vulnerable. My hope is that people go back to, the basics of just being kind. and this self-isolation and realizing people are important may just somehow help create, not only in our homes, but also in the workplace, a level of kindness that I believe, such as you just mentioned, for the past decade just doesn't seem to be there.
Yeah, sadly, the situation in our supermarkets at the moment doesn't give much hope.
Oh dear.
But hopefully, once everyone has enough toilet paper, we'll start looking after each other again. But
It's fair. Yes, definitely.
It's actually interesting to think. We're heading into a period. So as we record this, I mean, the for those that may be listening in the future, we're really starting to enter into the harshest of the COVID-19 precautions. And who knows, it might be worse by the time you're listening, hopefully not. But we're starting to have more and more workers that are working remotely that are now going back to their homes. There's going to come a time when we have to come back together again. And I'll be really interested to see what impact that has on workforces that have been completely separated, now having to cohabitate again. That will be interesting.
I think it will be, and even some of the traditional, meetings and, handshaking, different things that I don't know if they will come back to being the same. I'm hoping they will, but it will absolutely be interesting to hear and see how people are going to be so used to being on their own that working remotely, having the comforts of their home and their safety of their home, when they have to go back to work, where will the resentment be for those that maybe have to come back to work, and those ones who don't have to come back to work and can continue to work remotely. I think that the whole issue of bullying and bad behavior may spike too, in regards to those kinds of things.
Yeah, although one learning for me, having had 4 kids at home for the last week, is that the teachers aren't paid enough. So hopefully one of the outcomes is that teachers are more valued as we send our children back.
Absolutely.
Actually, I was had a meeting with a client last week, just before when we'll try to limit gatherings and limit meetings, but we weren't quite being militant about it yet. And they said that the greatest thing that's come out of this pandemic is that corporations are starting to realize how many pointless meetings they had previously. And I thought, if that is the only outcome, then we've achieved something.
Yes, where there are announcements that could be done on an email, and the time that is spent not actually engaging but reporting is now being limited, and that is a really interesting change.
Yeah,
that could have been done before.
Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to the massive evolution in webinar technology that will take place over the next 6 months. I think that'll
Right.
All right. Anyway, we are getting off topic, but we're coming up on time. So I just want to thank you for your time. Your book is Refusing to Accept the Unacceptable. You're kind enough to send me an ebook version, and I'm really enjoying reading it. I haven't got through the whole thing yet, but it is a very important topic, and I think it's very well written and very engaging. So if you're interested in the conversation that we've just had, I highly recommend picking up that book. Denise, if people want to know more about you, or they want to book your consulting services, where can they go to learn more?
My website is Koster Consulting Associates.com. My LinkedIn profile has a tremendous amount of information on it under Denise Koster, Koster. And my email is koster@istar.ca. So there's a number of venues, but my website and my LinkedIn is probably, particularly my LinkedIn is most current in regards to, what I'm doing, what I'm, producing articles and different things on the whole issue of workplace discrimination, harassment, and bullying. I'm also focusing on the whole issue of threat assessments and violence in the workplace, which we haven't really discussed at this point, but that's another area that I'm greatly involved in. So yes, there's a number of ways to contact me.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time. I think this is such an important topic, and it's one that we haven't explored previously on the show. So I'm very grateful to have you on, and I would actually like to get you back again in the future to talk about threat assessment, because I think that deserves a show on its own.
That'd be great. Thank you so much, Joe.
No problem. All right. For our Patreon subscribers, make sure you stay tuned for the bonus questions, which will be available on www.patreon.com/managing violence. And for now, let's head over there.
Thank you again to Denise for a very important episode. And if you'd like to support the show, head over to www.patreon.com/managing violence. Sign up. You'll get all the bonus content from every episode this season. And you'll also be contributing to me continuing to do the show. So I thank you very much for that. Also, check out our website at www.joesaunders.com.au and all our social media. Until then, I'll talk to you next time.